The hand that gripped the boy's wrist was thin and cold. The old congressman had been bedridden for weeks, but his eyes, when he opened them at last, were clear. He had asked the doctor and the nurses to leave the room. He had asked his wife to close the door. And with the last reserves of strength he had left in his body, he pulled his son closer and began to speak. What he said in that room would haunt the boy for the rest of his life. He would refuse to repeat it to reporters. He would refuse to repeat it in interviews. He would write about his father's career, but he would never, not once, put those final words on paper. They would only surface decades later in private letters between members of the family. And the warning at the center of those words was so specific, so detailed, and so accurate that historians who study the period have one of two reactions. They either dismiss it as the rambling of a sick old man, or they go very quiet. His name was Charles August Lindbergh. He served 5 terms in the United States Congress, representing the state of Minnesota. He was a lawyer, a farmer, and by every account that survives, an honest man. And in the year 1913, he became the only member of the House of Representatives who sat down and read every single page of a bill that would change the country forever. The bill was over 100 pages long. It had been drafted in secret. It had been rushed to the floor in the final days of the legislative session, when most congressmen had already left town for Christmas. And when the vote was called, Lindbergh stood up, walked to the well of the House, and told his colleagues that they were about to commit the greatest financial crime in American history. They laughed at him. They voted anyway. And he spent the next 12 years of his life trying to warn the country about what they had done. Before we go any further, if you find buried history like this fascinating, the kind of story that never makes it into a textbook, take 1 second right now and subscribe. Hit the bell so you do not miss the next one. We dig up the cases the official record tried to forget, and we post a new one every week. Now back to the room where the old congressman was dying, and the warning he made his son swear to remember. To understand that warning, you have to understand the law he was warning him about. In November of 1910, 6 men boarded a private rail car at a small station in New Jersey. They were instructed not to use their last names. They were told to dress as duck hunters. The car had no markings. The destination was not on any public schedule. The men were Senator Nelson Aldrich, who controlled the Senate Finance Committee, Henry Davison, a senior partner at J.P. Morgan and Company, Frank Vanderlip, the president of the National City Bank of New York, Charles Norton, the president of the First National Bank of New York, Benjamin Strong, the head of Bankers Trust Company, and Paul Warburg, a German-born investment banker representing the Kuhn-Loeb firm, and through it the European banking dynasties of the Rothschilds and the Warburgs. The men travelled south through the night in total silence. Their destination was a small private island off the coast of Georgia, owned by the most exclusive hunting club in America. Membership was limited to 100 families. The names on the roll included Morgan, Rockefeller, Astor, and Vanderbilt. Together, those families controlled, by some estimates, 1/6 of the entire wealth of the planet. The island was called Jekyll Island, and the meeting that took place there over the following 9 days would produce the first draft of what was, at that point, the most secret piece of legislation in the history of the United States Congress. The men knew that what they were doing was politically impossible. The American public, going back to Thomas Jefferson, had a deep and instinctive hatred of central banks. Andrew Jackson had killed the second bank of the United States in 1836 and built a national legend out of doing it. Any politician who openly proposed handing the country's money supply to a private banking cartel would be voted out of office within a single election cycle. So the men at Jekyll Island agreed on a strategy. They would not call it a central bank. They would call it a Federal Reserve System. They would design it to appear decentralized, with 12 regional branches scattered across the country. But the real power, the control over interest rates and the money supply, would sit in New York. And the men who would run it would be the same men sitting in that room. When the 6 men left Jekyll Island, they took an oath of secrecy that held for over 20 years. The existence of the meeting was not publicly admitted until 1930, when Frank Vanderlip wrote about it in the Saturday Evening Post. By then the law they had drafted in that hunting lodge was already the law of the land. The bill was introduced in Congress in 1913. It was officially called the Federal Reserve Act. It was presented to the American people as a reform measure, a way to prevent the kind of banking panics that had nearly destroyed the country in 1907. The press coverage was overwhelmingly positive. The bankers, in public, opposed it loudly, which made the public assume it must be bad for the bankers and therefore good for the people. It was a brilliant piece of political theatre. But Charles Lindbergh read the bill. He read every page, and he understood exactly what it did. On the floor of the House of Representatives, on the 22nd day of December 1913, Lindbergh delivered a speech that the congressional record preserved, but the newspapers refused to print in full. He told his colleagues that the bill before them established what he called the most gigantic trust on earth. He said that when the President of the United States signed it into law, the invisible government by the money power would be legalized. He said the people would not know it had happened, but the day of reckoning was only a few years removed. He warned that the new system would be used to create inflation whenever the bankers wanted inflation, and recessions whenever they wanted recessions. He said it would transfer the wealth of the working American into the vaults of a handful of families, slowly, almost invisibly, over the course of 100 years. The bill passed the House late that evening. It passed the Senate 2 days later. President Woodrow Wilson signed it on the 23rd of December, while most of Washington was already home for the holidays. Wilson, near the end of his life, would write in his private papers that he had unwittingly ruined his country, that a great industrial nation was now controlled by its system of credit, and that the growth of the nation was in the hands of a few men. By then it was too late. The Federal Reserve System was operational, and Charles Lindbergh, the lone congressman who had read the bill and understood it, set out on the second mission of his life. He wrote a book. He titled it Banking and Currency and the Money Trust. He documented the Jekyll Island meeting in everything but name. He identified the men involved. He explained in detail how the new system would be used to harvest the savings of ordinary Americans through inflation. He explained that every dollar created by the new bank would be created as debt, that the bank would lend money into existence and charge interest on it, and that the interest could never be paid back because the money to pay it had not been created. He explained that this would force the United States Treasury, year after year, to issue more debt simply to service the debt that already existed. He predicted the national debt, less than $3 billion in 1913, would within a single lifetime grow to numbers the human mind could not picture. He predicted the dollar would lose more than 90% of its purchasing power before his grandson was an old man. The book was published in 1913. It received almost no reviews. The major newspapers, owned in large part by men who had been at Jekyll Island or who banked with them, refused to mention it. Copies began to disappear from bookstores. Lindbergh, who had paid for the printing himself, was told that a fire had destroyed the publisher's warehouse, and with it most of the unsold copies. He wrote a second book. He titled it Why Your Country is at War. It was published in 1917, the year the United States entered the European War. In it, Lindbergh argued that the war had been engineered in part by the same banking interests that had captured the country's monetary system 4 years earlier. He argued that wars create debt, that debt requires interest, and that interest flows to the men who issue the debt. He argued that the American boys being shipped to France were being sent to die so a small number of bankers in New York and London could grow richer. The federal government responded by sending agents to the printing plant. The plates were seized, the unbound pages were burned. Lindbergh, by then defeated for re-election in a campaign funded by interests he had spent his career exposing, would say later that the destruction of his second book hurt him more than the loss of his seat. He ran for the Senate. He lost. He ran for governor of Minnesota. He was defeated again. He was painted in the press as a German sympathizer, as a crank, as a man whose theories about hidden banking cabals could not be taken seriously. The same press that would not print his speeches in 1913 made certain to print every accusation against him in 1918. By the early 1920s, his health was failing. He was diagnosed with a brain tumour. He spent his final months in the care of his family. And it was during those final months that he called his son to his bedside. The boy in the room was in his early 20s. He was tall, quiet, mechanically gifted, already obsessed with airplanes. His name was Charles Augustus Lindbergh, named for his father, and within a few short years of his father's death, he would become the most famous human being on the planet, the first man to fly solo across the Atlantic Ocean. But that night, in that room, he was just a son listening to a dying father. The old congressman spoke for nearly an hour. He told the boy 3 things. He told him to remember the names of the men who had been at Jekyll Island, and the names of their sons and the names of their grandsons, because the same families would still be sitting at the table when the boy himself was an old man. He told him that the dollar he was holding in his pocket would, within the boy's own lifetime, be worth less than 1/10 of what it was worth that night. He told him that there would be one final crisis, a great unwinding, a moment when the debts could no longer be hidden and the currency could no longer be propped up, and that when that moment came, the men who controlled the system would not lose their wealth. They would only transfer it from the paper they had created into the things they had always wanted to own: the land, the water, the minerals, the food, the houses of the people who could no longer afford to keep them. He told his son to be ready, to watch the cycles, to recognize the signal before the unwinding. And he told him something else, the part of the warning the family would never repeat, the part that some who have studied the private papers believe involved specific dates and specific institutions, and that the boy, the future aviator, would carry in his head for the rest of his life and refuse to share with another living soul. The old congressman died not long after. His son walked out of the room and never publicly spoke about that conversation again. A few years later, he flew the Spirit of St. Louis from New York to Paris. He became a household name in every country on earth. And in the decades that followed, as he watched the dollar lose its gold backing, as he watched the national debt cross into the trillions, as he watched the same family names appear on the boards of the same institutions generation after generation, he gave only one indirect answer when reporters pressed him on his father's politics. He said simply that his father had been right about everything, and that the country would learn it the hard way. The numbers tell the rest of the story. In 1913, one United States dollar would buy what it took roughly $30 to buy a century later. The national debt, which had taken the country 137 years to grow to $3 billion, would, after the creation of the Federal Reserve, grow to over 30 trillion. The wealth of the top 1/10 of 1% of American households, which in 1913 was roughly equal to the wealth of the bottom 90%, would within 4 generations grow to many times that amount. Every prediction the old congressman whispered into his son's ear that night came true. Every single one. The men who built the system are still around in the names on the buildings, the foundations funding the universities, the family offices holding majority stakes in the same banks their great-grandfathers founded, in the room on Jekyll Island. If this is the first time you have heard this story, you are not alone. It has been carefully kept out of the textbooks. The man who read the bill, the warning he gave, the son who carried it, all of it sits just below the surface of the official record, waiting for anyone willing to look. Subscribe, because next week we are going to open the second book Charles Lindbergh wrote, the one the government burned, and we are going to read page by page what they did not want you to remember.